this video, we uncover the most shocking true crime stories in U.S. history. Daughters who turned against their own parents. These chilling cases will make you question, how could family bonds break in such a terrifying way? Stay with us as we reveal the motives, the crimes, and the dark secrets behind these infamous murders. 1. Sarah Marie Johnson. Sarah Marie Johnson was just 16 years old when the idyllic quiet of Bellevue, Idaho, was shattered. The daughter of Diane and Alan Johnson, Sarah grew up in what seemed like a stable, middle-class family. Her father co-owned a landscaping company. Her mother worked at a medical clinic. To neighbors, the Johnsons were the picture of small-town respectability. But behind closed doors, Sarah's teenage years were marked by rebellion and increasing friction with her parents, especially over her choice of boyfriend, 19-year-old Bruno Santos. The relationship became the center of escalating family conflict. Santos was older, unemployed, and living in the U.S. without documentation details that deeply worried Diane and Alan. When they discovered Sarah had spent a night at his apartment, they demanded she end the relationship and even threatened to report him to police. For Sarah, whose teenage world revolved around her romance, their ultimatum felt unbearable. Friends later recalled hearing Sarah say she would do anything to stay with him, a chilling foreshadowing of what was to come. On the morning of September 2nd, 2003, the Johnson household turned into a crime scene. At dawn, Sarah retrieved a high-powered hunting rifle from the guest house. Her mother was asleep in bed. Her father was in the shower. Within moments, both were shot dead, her mother struck in the head, her father in the chest. Sarah ran to a neighbor's house, insisting an intruder had killed her parents. But investigators quickly grew suspicious. There were no signs of forced entry, and Sarah's behavior, described as oddly calm and even preoccupied with her appearance, raised questions. The investigation uncovered damning forensic evidence. In the family's trash, police found a bloody bathrobe and mismatched gloves. One latex, one leather. DNA tests linked the items to Sarah and her parents. Gunshot residue was discovered on the leather glove. The murder weapon matched the Johnsons' own rifle. Confronted with this evidence, Sarah maintained her innocence, but the case against her was overwhelming. In 2005, a jury convicted Sarah Johnson of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, citing the calculated nature of the crime and Sarah's lack of remorse, sentenced her to 2 concurrent life terms without the possibility of parole. Family members wept in court, torn between grief for Diane and Alan and disbelief that the killer was their own child. What drove a teenager from privilege to parricide? Psychologists found no severe mental illness, no history of abuse. Instead, the motive appeared heartbreakingly simple: defiance against parental control, a desperate act to preserve forbidden love. As the judge told Sarah during sentencing, "You had everything, and still you chose this." Nearly 2 decades later, that question lingers. How does love turn into something this deadly? 2. Patricia Columbo. Patricia Columbo was just 19 when she became the sole surviving member of her family and the prime suspect in their murders. Born in 1956, Patty grew up in Elk Grove Village, Illinois, in what looked like a typical suburban household. Her parents, Frank and Merrie Columbo, worked hard to give their children a comfortable life. Patty, their eldest, was strikingly pretty and popular in school. But family tensions began to surface after the birth of her younger brother, Michael. Friends recalled Patty's growing jealousy and feelings of neglect as her father's attention shifted to the new baby. By 16, Patty's life had veered sharply off course. While working at a coffee shop, she met Frank DeLuca, a married pharmacist twice her age. Their relationship quickly became an obsession, alienating Patty from her family. Frank and Merrie Columbo disapproved. Not only was DeLuca married with 5 children, but he was also nearly 2 decades older. Confrontations escalated. At one point, Patty's father physically fought DeLuca. Soon after, Patty left home to live with him, severing what little bond remained with her family. On May 4th, 1976, that rift turned deadly. Patty and DeLuca entered the Columbo family home with a handgun and household items they turned into weapons. Frank and Merrie were shot and beaten. 13-year-old Michael was also killed in the attack. Authorities later said the crime scene reflected sustained rage rather than a single moment of violence. The murders stunned the quiet Chicago suburb, 3 lives taken in a single night, leaving only Patty, who told police she had no idea who could have done it. Investigators quickly became suspicious. Patty's behavior was unnervingly detached. Instead of expressing shock or grief, she speculated about mob connections and suggested possible suspects. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered a disturbing plot. Patty had spent months trying to recruit others to kill her family and had drawn detailed diagrams of the house to assist would-be hitmen. When those plans failed, she and DeLuca carried out the murders themselves. Witness testimony, forensic evidence, and DeLuca's eventual confession sealed the case. In 1977, Patty Columbo and Frank DeLuca were convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. Each received sentences of 200 to 300 years in prison, a punishment designed to ensure they would never walk free. Decades later, Patty has appeared before the parole board multiple times, citing good behavior and rehabilitation. Each request has been met with fierce opposition from surviving relatives and investigators, who argue the calculated nature of the crime warrants permanent incarceration. What drove a teenage girl to orchestrate the destruction of her own family? Was it infatuation, jealousy, greed, or all 3 intertwined? Patty Columbo has never fully answered that question, and perhaps for the families left behind, no answer could ever be enough. 3. Carol Ann Hatley. Carol Ann Hatley was 42 years old when she became the focus of one of Phoenix's most disturbing family tragedies. She lived with her mother, 73-year-old Deborah Hatley, in a modest home they had shared for less than a year. Friends described Deborah as warm and devoted to her children, while Carol's adult life had been more complicated, marked by alcoholism, unstable relationships, and frequent financial troubles. What began as an arrangement for Carol to get back on her feet would ultimately set the stage for disaster. The relationship between mother and daughter had long been turbulent. Family members later revealed years of tension and domestic arguments, intensified by Carol's drinking. They warned authorities that she could become volatile when intoxicated. Although no recent police reports documented violence in the home, relatives quietly feared that the tension could one day boil over. In the months leading up to the summer of 2012, Carol's personal struggles deepened, and her reliance on alcohol increased. On July 30th, 2012, those underlying tensions erupted. Police were called to the Hatley residence in the early morning hours after Carol approached a neighbor, claiming her mother had died and needed help. Inside the home, officers discovered Deborah's body and evidence that Carol had begun to wrap it in plastic bags. Though Carol initially insisted she planned to take her mother to the hospital, investigators immediately found inconsistencies in her story. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of an outside attacker, and Carol herself appeared heavily intoxicated. The investigation revealed unsettling details. Detectives learned that Carol had waited hours after claiming to find her mother before alerting anyone. During interviews, she gave conflicting accounts, sometimes describing the scene in striking detail, other times denying involvement altogether. Forensic evidence and statements from family members, including reports of her volatile behavior when drinking, painted a grim picture. Carol was arrested the same day on suspicion of second-degree murder. In April 2013, Carol Hatley accepted a plea agreement. She admitted responsibility for her mother's death and was sentenced to 22 years in prison. The courtroom was filled with family members grieving not only the loss of Deborah, but also the irrevocable destruction of Carol's life. For them, justice felt necessary, but closure remained elusive. What drives a daughter to harm the very person who raised her? In Carol's case, psychologists pointed to years of strained family dynamics, substance abuse, and emotional instability rather than a single moment of madness. It is a reminder that behind many crimes are long histories of unresolved pain. As the judge pronounced her sentence, one unanswerable question lingered. Could this tragedy have been prevented if someone had intervened sooner? 4. Delores. Jean Eggert. Delores. Jean Eggert was 50 years old when she admitted to one of the most shocking crimes in Washington County's history, the murder of her own mother, 70-year-old Pauline DeVore. To outsiders, the DeVores lived a quiet life on their sprawling farm in rural Arkansas, but beneath the surface, the family dynamic was fraught with tension. Delores, Pauline's adult daughter from a previous relationship, had struggled for years with instability, strained finances, and fractured family ties. The relationship between mother and daughter was deeply complicated. Friends described Pauline as kind but strong-willed, while Delores was known to clash with her over personal and financial matters. Investigators later learned that Delores had also been involved in an inappropriate sexual relationship with her stepfather, Pauline's husband, Bob DeVore. This discovery shed light on a volatile home life, one where loyalty, resentment, and secrecy collided. On June 14, 2007, those tensions spiraled into violence. Delores lured her mother to a remote area of the family farm. There, she shot Pauline and later set fire to her remains in an attempt to conceal the crime. To make the scene appear like a home invasion, Bob DeVore reported the house burglarized and several firearms missing when he returned from a trip the next day. For nearly 2 years, Pauline's disappearance remained a mystery, with authorities suspecting foul play but lacking concrete evidence. The breakthrough came in 2009, when a witness stepped forward. This woman, who had assisted Delores after the murder, agreed to cooperate with investigators. She led police to the burn site on the farm, where charred bone fragments and dental crowns consistent with Pauline's were recovered. During the investigation, detectives also recorded phone calls and in-person conversations in which Delores admitted to destroying evidence and even disposing of some remains in a nearby river. Delores was arrested in April 2009 and initially charged with capital murder, facing overwhelming evidence. She later pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in 2010 as part of a plea agreement, sparing her the possibility of a life sentence without parole. She received 30 years in prison. Her stepfather, Bob DeVore, was later convicted for helping cover up the crime and staging the burglary scene. He was sentenced to 10 years. The motive appeared rooted in resentment and fear. Prosecutors suggested that Delores, accused of stealing from her mother, killed Pauline to prevent legal consequences and preserve her relationship with Bob DeVore. Psychologists noted elements of manipulation and long-standing dysfunction, though Delores never fully explained her actions. The case left behind a haunting question. How does a family collapse so completely that love and protection turn into betrayal and violence? For Pauline's friends and extended relatives, the tragedy is compounded by silence. The answers, like much of the evidence, may have been lost to the flames. 5. Amber Merrie Bray. Amber Merrie Bray was just 18 years old when she became the center of one of California's most shocking family murders. A former honor student and high school cheerleader, Amber seemed destined for a promising future. Raised in Burbank by her mother, Dixie Lee Hollier, an accomplished record executive at Warner Brothers, Amber lived in what many assumed was a typical suburban household. But behind closed doors, the relationship between mother and daughter was far more complicated, marred by frequent arguments and deep-seated resentment. By late 1995, Amber had fallen in love with Jeffrey Ayers, a 21-year-old high school dropout who shared her feelings of restlessness and rebellion. Their relationship became intense and isolating, as the pair spent hours writing letters filled with fantasies of a life together, one funded by her mother's $310,000 life insurance policy. In these letters, they meticulously planned what prosecutors would later call a blueprint for murder, describing how to stage a break-in, escape undetected, and start fresh with a house, car, and money of their own. On January 16th, 1996, their plan turned deadly. In the early morning hours, Amber left the door to the family home unlocked. Ayers entered armed with a revolver and kitchen knives, confronting Dixie as she slept. What followed was a chaotic and violent struggle that spilled through the house. Amber's younger sister, 15-year-old Amy, awoke to the commotion and tried to call 911, only to have Amber pull the phone cord from the wall. By the time police arrived, alerted by neighbors who heard gunshots, the crime was already over. Officers found Ayers straddling Dixie's body, his hands raised in surrender. Amber and Ayers were arrested that same morning. At first, Amber downplayed her role, but investigators uncovered the incriminating letters that revealed weeks of planning. In court, prosecutors argued that Amber was the driving force behind the murder, motivated by money and a desire to escape her strained home life. The defense countered, portraying Amber as a manipulated teenager who feared her mother's alleged strictness and clung to Ayers for love and security. The jury rejected the defense's claims. Both Amber Bray and Jeffrey Ayers were convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. In 1998, Amber was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict stunned many who had known her as a quiet, studious girl, a stark contrast to the cold, calculated figure described in court. Why would a daughter conspire to end her own mother's life? Was it truly about the inheritance or a desperate attempt to control her future? In the end, the unanswered questions only deepened the tragedy. A young woman who once seemed to have everything ahead of her, now serving a lifetime behind bars, defined forever by the choice she made one winter morning. 6. Rhonda Bell Martin. Rhonda Bell Martin was 49 years old when the dark secret of her life began to unravel. A waitress from Montgomery, Alabama, she appeared ordinary, modest, hardworking, and devoted to her family. But over nearly 2 decades, tragedy seemed to follow her. Husbands fell ill. Children died young. Even her own mother passed under mysterious circumstances. Few suspected that behind these heartbreaking losses was Rhonda herself. The pattern of death began in 1937 with the poisoning of her 3-year-old daughter, Imogene. Over the next 14 years, 2 more daughters, her mother, and 2 of her husbands also died. Each succumbed to unexplained illnesses that baffled doctors at the time. Yet outwardly, Rhonda mourned with the rest of the family, quietly collecting modest insurance payouts, amounts barely enough to cover funerals. She later denied money was ever her true motive, though prosecutors would point to those policies as evidence of premeditation. The murders might have gone unnoticed forever if not for her fifth husband, Ronald Martin. Once her own stepson, Ronald survived the poison but was left permanently paralyzed. His strange illness raised alarm. Investigators, looking back at Rhonda's tragic history, began to see a chilling pattern. Too many deaths, too close together, all tied to her care. When authorities confronted her in 1956, she confessed to 6 murders. Her mother, 2 husbands, and 3 children. She remained vague about her reasons, unable or unwilling to explain why she had done it. Rhonda was tried only for the murder of Claude Carroll Martin, her 4th husband. The evidence was overwhelming. Traces of arsenic, her own confession, and the suspicious series of similar deaths that preceded his. Her defense argued insanity, citing possible schizophrenia, but the jury rejected that claim, convicting her of first-degree murder. In June 1956, she was sentenced to die in Alabama's electric chair. Public reaction was a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. This quiet waitress, a mother and grandmother, had betrayed the most sacred trust imaginable. Yet some were struck by her demeanor, calm, polite, and eerily accepting of her fate. Before her execution, Rhonda left a handwritten note requesting her body be donated to science, hoping doctors might learn why I committed the crimes I have committed. On October 11th, 1957, Rhonda Bell Martin was executed at Kilby Prison. Her final meal was simple hamburger, mashed potatoes, cinnamon rolls, and coffee. She entered the chamber wearing a handmade black and white dress and a wedding ring, clutching a New Testament in her hand. She had nothing more to say. Was Rhonda Martin a cold opportunist or a deeply troubled woman lost in her own mind? Her confession closed the case, but left an unsettling question lingering. What drives a mother to destroy the very family she once nurtured? 7. Beulah Louise Overell. Beulah Louise Overell was just 17 years old when her life collided with one of the most sensational murder trials of the 1940s. Born into privilege as the only child of Walter and Beulah Overell, she was heiress to a fortune built on real estate and finance. To the outside world, she seemed to live an enviable life. Private schooling, expensive clothes, and summers aboard the family's yacht, the Merrie E. But behind the polished surface, family tensions were simmering. Her parents strongly disapproved of her fiancé, 21-year-old George Bud Gollum, a former Navy radio man and aspiring medical student. Their disapproval would become the prosecution's central theory for what happened next. On the night of March 15th, 1947, Newport Harbor was quiet until an explosion shattered the calm. The Merrie E., moored in the harbor, erupted into flame. Inside were Walter and Beulah's parents. When rescuers arrived, both were dead. At first, investigators assumed a tragic accident, possibly caused by leaking fuel, but as they combed through the wreckage, they found something far more sinister: sticks of dynamite wired to an alarm clock. Suspicion turned almost immediately toward Beulah and Bud. The young couple had been ashore during the blast, claiming they'd left to buy hamburgers, but investigators uncovered evidence tying them to the purchase of explosives the day before. Love letters exchanged between them, intercepted in jail, painted an image of 2 teenagers obsessed with each other and fantasizing about escaping their parents' control. Prosecutors argued that Beulah's motive was clear. If her parents disinherited her for marrying Bud, the couple's dreams would collapse. The trial that followed was nothing short of a national spectacle. It stretched for 19 weeks, the longest criminal trial in Orange County history at the time. Reporters from Life and Time magazines packed the courtroom. Radio stations broadcast live updates. The prosecution alleged that Walter and Beulah Overell were bludgeoned to death with a hammer before the explosion, their deaths disguised as an accident. The defense countered that the explosion was either accidental or even orchestrated by Walter himself, who they claimed faced financial stress. The case against the couple was largely circumstantial. For every expert witness the prosecution presented, the defense dismantled their claims even theatrically, dumping a handful of supposedly rare clock screws across the courtroom to discredit forensic testimony. On October 5th, 1947, the jury returned a stunning verdict: not guilty. Cheers erupted in and outside the packed courthouse. Beulah walked free, her relationship with Bud already unraveling. They never married. In later years, Beulah's life drifted into obscurity, remarriages, financial decline, and eventually her death at 36 from acute alcoholism. The haunting question remains: was she a misunderstood heiress caught in a storm of circumstance? Or did the jury acquit a guilty soul who outlived the scandal? 8. Isabella Guzman. Isabella Guzman was just 18 years old when her name shocked the nation. Born in June 1995, she grew up in Aurora, Colorado, raised primarily by her mother, Yunmi Hoy. Friends and relatives describe Isabella as a quiet child who in her teenage years began showing signs of rebellion. Her parents' divorce left her splitting time between her mother and her biological father, a dynamic that often fueled conflict inside the home. In the months leading up to August 2013, tensions escalated. Yunmi had grown increasingly concerned about her daughter's behavior, skipping school bouts of defiance and threats that seemed to grow bolder over time. On the day of the murder, Isabella sent her mother an email containing 3 chilling words: "You will pay." Police were called to the house that same afternoon to mediate, warning Isabella that she could be forced to move out if the conflicts continued. Hours later, the situation would turn fatal. That evening, Yunmi returned home from work and went upstairs to shower. According to court records, Isabella's stepfather Ryan Hoy was downstairs when he heard loud thumping from the bathroom and his wife calling his name. When he tried to open the door, Isabella blocked it. Moments later, the door swung open. Ryan saw Isabella standing in the doorway holding a knife. She said nothing, her face blank, her eyes fixed straight ahead as she walked past him and left the house. Inside the bathroom, Yunmi lay unresponsive. Authorities later confirmed she had suffered multiple stab wounds to her face and neck. A baseball bat was found nearby, suggesting a desperate attempt to defend herself. Isabella fled the scene, but was located the next day in a nearby parking garage after a brief manhunt. Investigators quickly built their case. Alongside the threatening email, there were reports of escalating arguments and prior incidents of spitting and verbal abuse. Witness statements painted a portrait of a deeply fractured mother-daughter relationship. Public reaction was intense. Images of Isabella in court, wearing an orange jumpsuit and at times smiling or making faces at the camera, were broadcast nationwide, sparking debate over her mental state and motives. During legal proceedings, questions arose about Isabella's psychological profile. She was later found to be suffering from schizophrenia and was committed to a mental health facility rather than prison. Her case highlights the intersection of untreated mental illness and family conflict, raising broader questions about intervention before tragedy occurs. Today, Isabella Guzman remains under psychiatric care. The haunting image of a teenager standing silently in a doorway, knife in hand, lingers as a reminder. When family ties Fracture, how do we see the warning signs and who is left to stop the spiral before it turns deadly? 9. Cara Lounsbury. Cara Lounsbury was 32 years old when she stood accused of one of Colorado's most shocking family crimes. Born in 1977, Cara's upbringing was marred by what she later described as years of verbal and sexual abuse from her father, Harold Hap Anander. Friends and relatives recall a strained family dynamic that lingered well into adulthood. By 2009, Hap had remarried Velva Sue Anander, a woman Cara reportedly resented. The Ananders were financially comfortable operating Aquahot, a successful heating business in Adams County. But beneath the image of a church-going, hard-working family, tensions were quietly boiling. Cara's relationship with her father was complicated and volatile. In the months leading up to the murders, she was allegedly struggling with financial problems and feared she might be cut out of her father's will. Witnesses described her behavior as resentful and increasingly angry toward both Hap and Velva Sue. Prosecutors would later argue that money and long-simmering hatred were the key drivers of what happened next. On the night of January 14, 2009, the Ananders were asleep in their rural Hudson home. At around 3 in the morning, surveillance footage from a neighboring property captured Cara's vehicle pulling into the driveway. Investigators believe she entered the house armed, shooting her father in the back before turning on her stepmother. Velva Sue was shot multiple times and struck repeatedly in the head. Injuries, prosecutors said, reflected deep personal animosity. Afterward, Cara ransacked the house to make it look like a burglary and fled the scene. The investigation quickly unraveled her cover story. Detectives found inconsistencies in her account and surveillance footage tying her vehicle to the crime scene. A latex glove recovered in the bedroom carried DNA linked to Velva Sue and an unidentified female profile. Cara attempted to shift suspicion toward her brother Jared Anander, who lived next door, but prosecutors dismissed the claim as deflection. By February 26, 2009, she was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The trial drew intense media attention. Prosecutors framed the killings as an execution driven by greed and hatred, emphasizing the brutality inflicted on Velva Sue. The defense countered by pointing to Cara's claims of childhood abuse and suggesting her brother could have been responsible. In the end, jurors were unconvinced. After 7 hours of deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts on both counts. Cara Lounsbury was sentenced to 2 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole. The motive remains debated to this day. Was it purely financial, or was it years of resentment boiling over? As she was led away from the courtroom, one family member described her stepmother as a caring and giving woman, adding that even Sue had tried to help Cara find peace. It leaves an unsettling question when reconciliation is offered but never accepted. Does bitterness inevitably turn to tragedy? 10. Linda Pedrosa. Linda Pedrosa was just 17 years old when she became the center of one of Palm Beach County's most shocking homicide cases. Growing up in Florida, Linda had been described by neighbors as friendly and hardworking, but her home life told a different story. Her parents' relationship was turbulent. Her father had been arrested for domestic violence, and her mother, Isabella Pedrosa, worked long hours to support the family. By her teenage years, Linda's relationship with her mother had deteriorated, strained further by Linda's involvement with 23-year-old Antoine Wright. The tension at home escalated in the weeks before the crime. Isabel reportedly disapproved of Wright, especially after catching the two in an intimate situation. Arguments became frequent and intense. Friends later recalled Linda expressing anger toward her mother, blaming her for standing in the way of the relationship. Investigators would later discover that both Linda and Antoine were contemplating ways to be together without parental interference, and that thought would turn deadly. On June 23, 2000, an event came to a head. When Isabel returned home from work, she was ambushed inside the family's Palm Beach Gardens residence. Prosecutors alleged that Antoine struck her while Linda stood by, and together they strangled her using an electrical cord. In a desperate attempt to conceal what they had done, the couple placed the body in a bathtub filled with acid, hoping it would erase evidence. When that failed, they left the remains in a wooded area of the acreage and staged a story that Isabel had left town after an argument. For weeks, Linda lived as if nothing had happened. She reported her mother missing, spent stolen cash from Isabel's car, and even had her boyfriend's name tattooed on her chest. Neighbors recalled seeing the couple partying and shopping, unaware of the grim truth behind the mother's disappearance. The illusion ended on July 4th, when surveyors discovered Isabel's remains in the woods. Within days, Linda and Antoine were arrested. The investigation revealed a disturbing partnership. Letters exchanged between the pair from jail described undying devotion and even detailed plans to maintain a false alibi. Antoine eventually accepted a plea deal, agreeing to testify against Linda in exchange for a reduced sentence. Linda ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in 2002 and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. With good behavior, she could be released in her early 50s. Experts pointed to multiple factors: family dysfunction, teen rebellion, and the influence of an older boyfriend. But many remain haunted by the underlying question: could this tragedy have been prevented if someone had intervened sooner? The courtroom fell silent when Linda admitted her role with a single word: yes. That word ended a life, shattered a family, and left a community wondering how love in its most desperate form could lead to such devastation. 11. Jacqueline Reynolds. Jacqueline. Nikki Reynolds was 17 years old when she placed a call to 911, her voice trembling as she confessed she had just killed her mother. Nikki's life from the outside seemed almost ideal. Adopted as an infant by Robert and Billie Jean Reynolds, she grew up in a loving, religious household in Coral Springs, Florida. The Reynolds family was active in their church. Billie Jean sang in the choir, and Robert served as a deacon. Friends and neighbors remembered Nikki as polite and well-mannered, the kind of girl who never hinted at the turmoil boiling beneath the surface. That turmoil began in her teenage years. Nikki's relationship with her parents, especially Billie Jean, deteriorated rapidly during high school. She started dating Carlos Infante, and the romance was intense but chaotic. Breakups were followed by reconciliations, often fueled by Nikki's false claims of pregnancy. Her parents, worried about her erratic behavior, urged her to seek counseling. But Nikki resisted, and the tension in the home only deepened. By the spring of 1997, her emotional state was fragile. After another breakup with Infante, Nikki began making alarming statements, asking a church pastor if God forgave people who committed something really bad. Family members later described her as volatile and withdrawn, prone to sudden anger and despair. On May 14, 1997, after an argument with her mother, Nikki snapped. While Billie Jean worked on the family computer, Nikki retrieved a kitchen knife and attacked. In her later confession, Nikki claimed she initially planned to kill both her parents and her boyfriend, but stopped after her mother collapsed. The moments after were haunting Billie Jean, mortally wounded, reportedly told Nikki, "I love you. You just need help," even as her daughter begged for forgiveness. Police arrived within minutes of Nikki's 911 call. She was taken into custody and quickly confessed again, this time to detectives. During interviews, she revealed not only the attack, but the disturbing plan she had formed in the days leading up to it. At trial, Nikki's defense centered on claims of mental illness. Psychiatrists diagnosed her with major depression and borderline personality disorder. They argued she was incapable of fully understanding right from wrong at the time of the killing. But the jury rejected the insanity defense, convicting her of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 34 years in prison, later reduced to 21 years and 8 months after an appeal. Nikki Reynolds' story remains deeply unsettling. A young woman raised in a home of faith and love whose inner turmoil and obsession spiraled into unthinkable violence. It raises a haunting question: when someone loved so deeply turns against the very person who nurtured them, is it rage, illness, or something far darker? 12. Yudenia Rodriguez. Yudenia Rodriguez was 40 years old when a heated argument with her mother spiraled into an irreversible act of violence. Born in Cuba and raised in the United States, Yudenia's life was marked by instability. Her mother, Sonia Santiesteban, had endured decades of hardship to keep her family together. A single mother after escaping an abusive marriage, Sonia raised her children while working long hours as a housekeeper and later caring for her grandchildren. Those children were not hers by birth, but by choice. She adopted them after her son and their biological mother lost custody. By 2013, Sonia was wheelchair-bound after a workplace injury, living in a modest mobile home in Miami-Dade County, where every sacrifice she made was for the children in her care. Yudenia, however, struggled. Family members later revealed that she had a history of emotional instability and mental health issues, though she wasn't receiving consistent treatment. It's unclear why she moved back into her mother's home, but tensions quickly escalated. Living in close quarters, their relationship frayed under the weight of old resentments and unspoken grievances. On October 6, 2013, that fragile peace shattered. Sonia asked her daughter to leave the home, a confrontation that ignited a volatile reaction. Witnesses say Yudenia shoved her mother, who was unable to defend herself, and struck her repeatedly. When Sonia's 15-year-old granddaughter attempted to call 911, Yudenia allegedly stopped her, slapping the girl and taking the phone away. Moments later, she armed herself with a kitchen knife and attacked her mother in front of the terrified teen. Police arrived soon after, alerted by neighbors who heard the girl's screams. Yudenia was arrested at the scene and charged with second-degree murder along with child abuse and tampering with a witness. Her first court appearance shocked observers. She appeared disoriented, interrupting the judge, denying her mother's death, and even falling asleep during the hearing. The judge immediately ordered a psychological evaluation. The tragedy drew widespread attention in Miami-Dade, not only because of the brutal family dynamic, but because Sonia had been known for her compassion, adopting her grandchildren to spare them from foster care and leaning on her church community for support. Now, those same children were left without the only stable figure in their lives, placed under the temporary care of their pastor. Prosecutors described the crime as the culmination of years of unresolved mental health struggles and family tension. Yudenia's refusal to speak with investigators and her erratic courtroom behavior left many questioning whether untreated illness, resentment, or desperation drove her actions that day. In the end, the question remains haunting when a mother sacrifices everything for her children. What leads one of them to turn against her, and can any explanation ever make sense of such a loss? 13. Courtney Schulhoff. Courtney Christine Schulhoff was just 16 when her turbulent relationship with her father reached a deadly breaking point. Born in Washington, D.C., Courtney grew up in Florida after her parents divorced. She lived with her father, Stephen Schulhoff, in Altamonte Springs, a quiet suburban community. By her mid-teens, Courtney had dropped out of high school and was struggling to find direction. Around that time, she began dating Michael Morin, a 20-year-old with a criminal record. Stephen strongly disapproved, and their relationship became a constant source of conflict at home. Courtney's relationship with her father was complicated. She accused him of abuse claims that were never substantiated, but added to the tension between them. Friends described her as a teenager desperate for independence, often clashing with her father's strict rules. When Stephen cut off her access to credit cards and insisted she continue her education, Courtney's resentment deepened. On February 10, 2004, that resentment turned fatal. Investigators later learned that Courtney and Michael had discussed killing her father in the days leading up to the incident. That morning, Stephen was asleep in his bedroom when he was bludgeoned with a baseball bat. After the attack, Courtney and Michael drove his truck to a nearby McDonald's before returning later that day, attempting to figure out what to do next. The following day, Stephen's girlfriend discovered his body and called police. Both Courtney and Michael were arrested within hours. At first, Courtney told detectives that Michael committed the murder while she waited outside. Michael, however, claimed that Courtney orchestrated the plan, providing the weapon and urging him to act. Their conflicting stories created a tangled investigation, with each blaming the other for the crime. In 2006, Courtney was tried first. Prosecutors argued that even if Michael had swung the bat, Courtney masterminded the killing. The jury convicted her of first-degree murder, and because she was a minor, she was spared the death penalty, but sentenced to life without parole. Moments after hearing her sentence, Courtney stunned the courtroom by taking full responsibility. Michael Morin is not the person who killed my father. I was. Despite her confession, prosecutors proceeded with Michael's trial the following year. He admitted to the killing, but insisted he acted under pressure. He, too, received a life sentence. Psychological evaluations later revealed Courtney struggled with depression and possible trauma, though the court rejected an insanity defense. Her shifting confessions left many questioning whether she acted out of guilt, love for Michael, or both. Ultimately, the case forces a painful question when family bonds fracture beyond repair. Is there ever a moment where tragedy feels inevitable, or could a single intervention have changed everything? 14. Takeyia Guthridge. Takeyia Guthridge was 25 years old when a family dispute in Clayton County, Georgia, escalated into an irreversible tragedy. Takeyia grew up in a blended household with her mother, Delores Adu, and several step-siblings. Friends and neighbors described Louise as caring and hardworking, a woman who had taken on the responsibility of raising her family in a modest home in Jonesboro. But inside the walls of that house, tension brewed. Takeyya's relationship with her mother had deteriorated over years of conflict, fueled by financial strain, accusations of ingratitude, and repeated arguments about responsibility. By 2012, Takeyia was struggling to support herself and relied heavily on her mother. When Delores decided to evict her adult daughter from the family home, the fragile bond between them broke entirely. Court records show that on the morning of June 11th, they had just returned from a hearing where a judge gave Takeyia 7 days to move out. The decision left her humiliated, angry, and unsure of where she would go next. Later that afternoon, the argument reignited, this time over gas money. According to testimony, Louise refused, citing her daughter's refusal to help around the house and past behavior. The confrontation turned physical, and in front of her younger stepbrother, Takeyia, armed herself with a serrated kitchen knife and attacked her mother. Witnesses would later recall Delores screaming for help as her son struggled to intervene, ultimately fleeing to a neighbor's house for safety. Police arrived within minutes. Louise was rushed to a nearby hospital, but did not survive her injuries. Takeyia was arrested at the scene, calm and largely unresponsive, giving officers little explanation for what had just happened. During her trial in 2013, prosecutors painted a picture of deep-seated resentment and premeditation. Witnesses testified that in the days leading up to the murder, Takeyia repeatedly said she wished her mother was dead. The 911 call from that day stunned even seasoned investigators. Her flat tone and refusal to attempt CPR struck the judge as a chilling lack of remorse. The jury took only 20 minutes to convict her of murder. At sentencing, the judge echoed prosecutors' concerns. If ever released, he feared Takeyia would pose a danger to her own family. She was given life in prison without the possibility of parole. Psychological evaluations revealed no diagnosed mental illness, but prosecutors argued her actions stemmed from entitlement and long-building anger rather than sudden impulse. For the family left behind, grief mingled with disbelief. They mourned Delores while grappling with the reality that the killer was her own daughter. In the end, the case forces an unsettling reflection. What fractures in a family turn love into resentment, and how do those fractures remain invisible until it's too late to repair them? 15. Pamela Moss. Pamela Moss was 55 years old when her life of manipulation, deception, and violence reached its breaking point in March of 2012. Born in Georgia in 1957, Moss came from an outwardly ordinary family, but her adult life was marked by financial instability and turbulent relationships. A college-educated woman with a degree in psychology, she built a career as a grant writer, positioning herself as someone who could help others secure funding for charitable projects. But behind that facade was a troubling history 16 years earlier. Moss had pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter for poisoning her own mother. She served 8 years in prison, was released in 2005, and quietly re-entered society. Few could have imagined that history would repeat itself. By 2012, Moss had entangled herself in a business arrangement with 67-year-old Doug Coker, a Henry County businessman who invested $85,000 into what he believed was a charitable housing project. When repayments stalled, Coker arranged to meet Moss at a McDonald's in Macon on March 13th, expecting to retrieve his money. He never returned home. Investigators later uncovered that Moss lured Coker back to her house, struck him repeatedly with a hammer, and concealed his body beneath her porch. In the days that followed, she attempted to clean the crime scene with bleach, covered bloodstains with paint, and even left her home filled with natural gas, suggesting a desperate attempt to destroy evidence. The discovery of Coker's body triggered a deeper investigation into Moss's past. Prosecutors learned of her prior conviction in her mother's death, painting a portrait of a woman capable of extreme violence when cornered. Defense attorneys, however, presented a different narrative. Moss, they claimed, suffered from dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. Psychologists testified that alternate personalities named Carol and Caroline occasionally took control, and that Moss may have been in a delusional state during the attack. Jurors were unconvinced. The evidence of planning receipts for bleach and lime, efforts to mislead police, and multiple inconsistent stories pointed to someone who understood right from wrong. After just 30 minutes of deliberation, the jury found Moss guilty of murder. During sentencing, the courtroom fell silent as Doug Coker's widow addressed Moss directly. She described her husband as a kind and honest man, a family man who loved cheering for the Atlanta Falcons. "I think you are evil," she said quietly. "And that is the only way God would let this happen." The judge agreed, calling Moss calculating and manipulative, and sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This case leaves a haunting question in its wake. When someone repeats the ultimate betrayal first against a parent, and then against another unsuspecting victim, do we blame mental illness? Or do we confront the possibility of something far darker? Something that lies beyond diagnosis. 16. Melissa Nicole Norris. Melissa Nicole Norris was only 15 years old when she was accused of committing one of the most shocking crimes in McDuffie County's history, the murder of her own father. Born in 1980, Melissa grew up in Thompson, Georgia, in a home where tensions were never far from the surface. Her parents were separated, leaving Melissa and her siblings largely in the care of their father. Charles Barry Norris, a 39-year-old man known in town for his strict parenting style. Friends recalled Melissa as a quiet ninth grader with a small social circle struggling to balance adolescence with the instability at home. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, arguments between Melissa and her father had become frequent. Prosecutors later suggested that Charles disapproved of her friends and resented her growing independence, while Melissa's defense attorneys painted a different picture. One in which years of family conflict, particularly between Charles and Melissa's older brother Clifton, had left the household on edge. On the evening of December 20th, 1995, the fragile balance shattered. Charles Norris was found slumped on the living room couch, a single gunshot wound to the back of his head. The murder weapon, a .38 caliber revolver, belonged to Clifton. Investigators quickly focused on Melissa after Clifton told police that she had pulled the trigger. Within hours, she confessed a statement taken at 3:30 a.m. in the presence of her mother. Melissa later claimed she confessed only to protect her brother, believing she would face juvenile detention rather than adult prison. The case against Melissa unfolded in the courtroom nearly 2 years later. Prosecutors argued she acted out of anger after an argument and deliberately retrieved the gun. The defense countered with an explosive claim Clifton was the true killer, and Melissa was a scared teenager coerced into taking the blame. Her tearful testimony described hearing the fatal shot from her bedroom, turning up the volume on her television to drown out yet another fight between father and son. But the jury didn't believe her. Deliberations lasted just over 30 minutes. Melissa was found guilty of malice murder, aggravated assault, and weapons possession. Judge Pernell Davis sentenced her to life in prison plus 5 years. Appeals would follow, including arguments over whether she fully understood her constitutional rights when she confessed, but each was denied. The motive remains clouded in contradiction. Was it teenage rebellion, years of family conflict, or misplaced loyalty to her brother? The courts concluded she was solely responsible. In the end, This case raises a painful question. When a child kills a parent, is it an act born from a single moment of rage or the final chapter in a story of dysfunction that no one else saw coming? 17. Tasmiyah and Jasmiyah. Whitehead. Jasmiyah and Tasmiyah Whitehead were just 16 years old when they were arrested for the killing of their mother, Jarmeka Nikki Whitehead, in Conyers, Georgia. The twins were once described as bright, ambitious, and talented. They had been Girl Scouts straight-A students and active in school activities. But by their teenage years, their lives had become increasingly chaotic. Their father lived abroad, and custody battles placed them between their mother, Nikki, and their great-grandmother, Della Frazier. Family tension brewed for years with frequent police calls and juvenile court involvement. By 2008, the twins' behavior had changed dramatically. School attendance dropped, arguments with Nikki escalated, and allegations of drug use and boy troubles fueled conflict at home. Nikki, who worked as a beautician and was attending school for fashion design, struggled to manage her daughter's rebellious streak. Friends say she feared her daughters but never believed they could harm her. On January 13, 2010, only a week after the twins were returned to Nikki's custody, a violent confrontation erupted. That morning, the girls woke up late for school, sparking another argument in the kitchen. The dispute turned physical. According to later testimony, a pot was thrown, a knife was grabbed, and a struggle spiraled out of control. When the fight ended, Nikki had suffered fatal wounds. Rather than call for help immediately, the twins claimed they found their mother dead after school. They flagged down a deputy nearby, presenting themselves as shocked and grieving daughters. But investigators quickly noticed inconsistencies. Scratches, bite marks, and unexplained injuries covered the twins' bodies. Forensic evidence linked them to the scene, blood traces, DNA, and a timeline that didn't match their story. 4 months later, both girls were arrested and charged with murder. The case drew national attention not only because of their age, but because they were identical twins, inseparable even in suspicion. In 2014, Tasmiyah accepted a plea deal admitting guilt to voluntary manslaughter and related charges. She received a 30-year sentence. Jasmiyah followed months later with the same plea and identical sentence. Psychologists noted patterns of escalating family dysfunction, a cycle of strict rules, adolescent rebellion, and a fractured support system. Prosecutors emphasized that the twins had previously threatened their mother's life during counseling sessions, suggesting the crime was less a sudden outburst and more a tragic culmination of years of unresolved conflict. During sentencing, Nikki's mother, the twins' grandmother, wept openly. She told the court she loved her granddaughters, but lamented that no one had taught them right from wrong. Her words captured the heartbreak of a family torn apart. There are no winners here. In the end, this case leaves a haunting question when teenagers turn against a parent. Is it a single moment of rage or the breaking point in a family already at war with itself? 18. Jacquelin Gibons. Jacquelin Gibons was just 20 years old when she orchestrated one of Illinois's most shocking parricide cases, the brutal murder of her adoptive parents, Benjamin and Sybil Gibons. Jacquelin had been adopted later in her parents' lives. The Gibons were financially comfortable and devoted to their only child, but their generosity often enabled her destructive habits. By her teenage years, Jacquelin's life had spiraled into debt, drug use, and turbulent relationships. At the center of her troubles was Barry Wilson, a 21-year-old boyfriend with a criminal history who relied heavily on Jacqueline's money to sustain his own habits. The Gibons tried repeatedly to intervene, cutting off Jacqueline's credit cards, driving her home from work to avoid Wilson, and pleading with her to end the toxic relationship. But their efforts only deepened Jacqueline's resentment. Conversations with Wilson soon turned from frustration to fantasy. Life would be easier, they imagined, if her parents were simply gone. On July 29th, 1982, those fantasies turned deadly. Jacqueline arranged for Wilson and another man, Robert St. Pierre, a recently released offender, to enter her family home in Skokie. While her parents went about their evening routines, St. Pierre attacked Benjamin Gibons with a hammer. Hours later, when Sybil returned home, she met the same fate. Her reported final words were directed at her daughter. "How could you do this to me?" In the days that followed, Jacqueline maintained a chilling calm. She called her parents' workplaces to say they were sick, cashed her paycheck, and even went shopping. But behind the scenes, the trio attempted to clean the scene, dispose of blood-stained carpeting, and eventually transport the bodies hundreds of miles away to New Mexico. The facade unraveled quickly. Detectives already aware of tensions in the household found the Gibons' home in disarray. Blood traces, cut-up carpets, and a crude hole in the closet wall leading to the garage. Forensic evidence, along with conflicting statements, pointed back to Jacqueline. During questioning, her composure cracked. She blurted out a confession implicating herself and both accomplices. The ensuing trials riveted Chicago. Prosecutors portrayed Jacqueline as manipulative and calculating, motivated by money and loyalty to Wilson. Defense attorneys countered that she was emotionally immature, easily influenced, and struggling with mental health issues, including a history of aggressive behavior diagnosed in her youth. Ultimately, Jacqueline pled guilty and was sentenced to 60 to 80 years in prison, effectively a life sentence. Wilson received the same. St. Pierre initially faced the death penalty, but later pled guilty and was spared execution. Today, Jacqueline's case remains a haunting study in parricide, a young woman torn between dependency and rebellion, love and resentment. It forces an unsettling question. How does a family's devotion transform into the very motive for its destruction? 19. Esmie Tseng. Esmie Tseng was 16 years old, a prodigy in academics and music, when she shocked her suburban Kansas community by killing the very person who had raised her. Her mother, Shu Yi Zhang, born to Chinese immigrant parents, Esmie's life outwardly embodied success. She was an honor student, a gifted pianist, and active in debate and athletics. But behind closed doors, tensions simmered. Esmie's parents held impossibly high expectations. Anything less than perfection, even a score of 96%, could lead to harsh punishments. In her private diaries, Esmie wrote of feeling suffocated of a home where love and criticism blurred into one exhausting cycle. By her mid-teens, Esmie's struggle for independence deepened. Her writings hinted at mental health challenges, feelings of isolation, sleepless nights, and flashes of resentment toward her parents, particularly her mother. Friends later recalled seeing warning signs, bouts of anger, uncharacteristic outbursts, even fears of losing control. On August 19, 2005, those tensions erupted. During an argument at their Overland Park home, Esmie armed herself with a kitchen knife and fatally stabbed her 55-year-old mother. The confrontation moved through several rooms, ending a relationship fraught with pressure and unspoken pain. Neighbors were stunned. This was no troubled delinquent. This was a girl they described as sweet, intelligent, and polite. But the reality was more complicated. Esme's diary painted a different picture, a teenager torn between wanting to please her parents and yearning for freedom from relentless expectations. Police arrested Esmie the same day. Prosecutors, citing the severity of the crime, pushed to try her as an adult. Advocates disagreed, pointing to her youth and emotional state, arguing she needed rehabilitation, not incarceration. The debate divided the community. Was Esmie a danger to society or simply a broken child failed by the adults around her? Ultimately, Esmie pled guilty to voluntary manslaughter in adult court. In 2006, she was sentenced to 8 years and 4 months in prison. She served her time at the Topeka Correctional Facility, the youngest inmate in the prison's population. Supporters worried for her safety. Prosecutors, however, argued the adult sentence was necessary, citing the extreme violence of the act. Psychologists later reflected on the case, noting themes common in parricide: intense parental pressure, adolescent impulsivity, and a sudden breaking point. While Esme's life appeared picture-perfect, her journals revealed someone quietly unraveling, a girl, masking her pain behind achievements. Esmie Tseng was released in 2012. Today, she remains a polarizing figure, a reminder that even the most outwardly promising lives can hide silent storms. And it leaves a haunting question when the demand for perfection becomes unbearable. What happens to the child who finally stops trying to meet it? 20. Lizzie Borden. Lizzie Andrew Borden was 32 years old when her name became forever etched into American crime lore, accused of killing her father and stepmother in their Fall River, Massachusetts home. Born into a well-to-do yet frugal household, Lizzie's childhood was defined by strict religious values and modest living, despite her father's considerable wealth. Andrew Borden was a successful businessman, but his choice to keep the family in a simple, aging home without indoor plumbing on the lower floors created tension between him and his daughters Lizzie and Emma. Their relationship with their stepmother, Abby, was strained. Lizzie never called her mother, instead referring to her formally as Mrs. Borden. In the months before the murders, family tensions deepened. Disputes over property and inheritance stirred resentment, and a disturbing incident, Andrew's killing of Lizzie's pet pigeons with a hatchet, left lingering bitterness. Adding to the unease, all members of the household had fallen mysteriously ill, days before the murders, prompting Abby to worry about possible poisoning. On the morning of August 4th, 1892, the unease turned fatal. Abby Borden was found in an upstairs guest bedroom, struck repeatedly in the head with a hatchet. Less than 90 minutes later, Andrew Borden was discovered downstairs, similarly attacked, while resting on a couch. Lizzie's voice carried through the house, calling for the maid. "Father's dead. Somebody came in and killed him." But suspicion quickly fell on her. Investigators noted inconsistencies in Lizzie's statements and a lack of evidence of forced entry. A hatchet was discovered in the basement with its handle missing. Days later, Lizzie burned a dress she claimed was stained with paint, a move prosecutors argued was an attempt to destroy evidence. Her trial the following year captivated the nation. Prosecutors presented circumstantial evidence, including Lizzie's strained relationship with her stepmother and her alleged attempt to buy poison the day before the murders. The defense countered that there was no blood on Lizzie, no witnesses, and no conclusive murder weapon. In a dramatic courtroom moment, the skulls of Andrew and Abby were presented as evidence, causing Lizzie to faint. After just 90 minutes of deliberation, the jury acquitted her. Public opinion, however, remained divided. While many saw her as an innocent woman wrongly accused, others believed she had escaped justice due to her gender and social standing. Lizzie lived the rest of her life in Fall River, enduring social ostracism until her death in 1927. The murders were never solved, and speculation endures more than a century later. The skipping rhyme immortalized her story. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. Yet history records fewer blows and no clear answers. The haunting question lingers. Did Lizzie Borden get away with murder, or was she the victim of one of America's earliest media frenzies? 21. Stacey Lannert. Stacey Ann Lannert was just 18 years old when she walked into her family's home on the night of July 4, 1990, and made a choice that would alter her life forever. Raised in Missouri, Stacey grew up in what appeared to be a typical middle-class household. But behind closed doors, the reality was far darker. For years, she endured sexual abuse at the hands of her father, Tom Lannert abuse that reportedly began when Stacey was only 8 years old. The trauma shaped her adolescence, leaving her withdrawn and desperate for protection. Her younger sister, Christy, was her only source of comfort. But when Stacey learned that Christy, too, had become her father's target, she reached a breaking point. By the summer of 1990, Stacey's home life was defined by fear and silence. Her parents' divorce had left the sisters in Tom's custody, and the abuse escalated. Stacey had tried to speak out, telling counselors, babysitters, even a psychiatrist about what was happening, but no intervention ever came. With nowhere to turn, Stacey began to fantasize about escape and increasingly about ending her father's reign of control. On Independence Day, those thoughts became action. Stacey entered her house in the early morning hours, found a rifle in the basement, and approached her sleeping father on the living room couch. She fired once, injuring him, but not ending his life. After a brief hesitation and his angry demands for help, she returned moments later and fired a second shot, killing him instantly. The next day, Stacey staged the scene as though she had discovered his body. But inconsistencies in her story quickly unraveled under police questioning. Within hours, she confessed to the shooting, citing years of abuse and her desperate need to protect her sister. Despite this, the legal system offered her little sympathy. At trial, prosecutors painted Stacey's motive as financial, arguing she killed her father to inherit his estate. The defense attempted to introduce evidence of battered spouse syndrome, adapted to explain the dynamics of child abuse, but the court ruled it inadmissible. Self-defense was also rejected. Because her father was asleep, the jury was instructed that Stacey faced no immediate threat. In 1992, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Public opinion shifted years later as Stacey's story gained attention. Advocates argued that her trial had failed to fully consider the psychological impact of long-term abuse. After nearly 2 decades behind bars, Missouri's governor commuted her sentence in 2009, making her eligible for immediate release. Today, Stacey Lannert works to help other survivors of abuse. But her story still raises painful questions. When the system fails to protect a child, how much responsibility do we place on the child for the choices they make to survive? 22. Tina Lunney. Tina Lunney was 41 years old when she murdered her mother, Merrie, in their shared New Jersey home a crime that shocked a quiet suburban community. On the surface, Tina's life seemed ordinary. She was a wife, a mother of two, and a daughter caring for her elderly mother in a middle-class neighborhood of Fairfield Township. But behind closed doors, her world was unraveling. Mounting debts from gambling, unpaid bills, and an extramarital affair with a local police officer pushed Tina to the brink. Friends and family would later say there were no outward signs of violence, only quiet desperation. By the summer of 2009, Tina's financial troubles had spiraled out of control. She had spent her husband's $30,000 inheritance, ignored collection agencies, and fallen months behind on the mortgage. As her personal life deteriorated, she turned to her mother for financial help. But when 74-year-old Merrie Zappi refused her daughter's repeated demands for money, tensions boiled over into tragedy. On July 22, 2009, Tina strangled her mother with one of her husband's neckties. In a calculated attempt to avoid suspicion, she staged the scene to resemble a suicide, even leaving a note that read, "Tell the kids I love them. You don't need me anymore." Hours later, Tina returned to her family as if nothing had happened, going to work, caring for her children, and pretending her mother had gone out for the day. But the facade quickly crumbled. Police uncovered inconsistencies in Tina's account, including the use of her mother's credit cards shortly after the death to pay bills and book a vacation. Within days, Tina confessed during a videotaped interview, casually describing the moment she snapped while applying lotion to her mother's neck. Prosecutors called the confession chilling for its matter-of-fact tone. At trial, Tina's defense painted a picture of mental illness, citing her later diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and claiming the confession was coerced during a psychological breakdown. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence, no DNA on the necktie, no clear proof of premeditation. But prosecutors countered with a simple narrative Tina killed for money, and every action she took afterward, from staging the scene to using her mother's credit cards, pointed to calculation, not confusion. The jury agreed. In May 2013, Tina Lunney was convicted of first-degree murder and later sentenced to 40 years in prison. During sentencing, the judge described her actions as heinous and depraved. For Marie's surviving family, the verdict provided closure, though the emotional wounds ran deep. And so remains the haunting question. When financial desperation meets family obligation, what turns quiet resentment into unthinkable betrayal, and how close could any of us be to that breaking point? 23. Brigitte Harris. Brigitte Harris was 26 when she killed her father, Eggert Guthridge, inside her small apartment in Rockaway, Queens. To the outside world, she was a quiet young woman working airport security. But beneath that exterior was a lifetime of pain. Brigitte's childhood was fractured almost from the start. Abandoned by her mother at age 2, she grew up moving between relatives in the United States and Liberia. The home she returned to was not a refuge. She later revealed that her father began sexually abusing her when she was just 3 years old, and that the abuse continued for much of her childhood. Her sister Carlene would later come forward with similar claims. Both said they had tried to speak out, but their warnings were dismissed or ignored. By 2007, Brigitte was living alone and struggling to heal from those scars. Then she learned something that reignited her deepest fears. Her father back in New York was planning to take 2 young granddaughters with him to Liberia. Brigitte believed she was watching history repeat itself. On July 28th, she invited her father to her apartment, hoping to convince him not to take the children. The conversation quickly turned heated. According to Brigitte's own account, she handcuffed him to keep him from leaving, stuffed a towel in his mouth to muffle his shouting, and in a moment of rage and panic, used a scalpel to sever his penis, believing this would stop him from harming anyone again. She insisted later that she never intended to kill him, but her father suffocated before help arrived. When police discovered the scene, Brigitte did not deny what she had done. Her internet searches for castration techniques and her MySpace moniker, Lady Vengeance, became evidence of premeditation. Yet her defense painted a different picture, a woman traumatized since childhood, desperate to protect the next generation from the same fate. The trial divided public opinion. Some saw Brigitte as a cold-blooded killer. Others viewed her as a victim pushed beyond breaking point. Even members of the jury were moved by her testimony of abuse and fear. In the end, they rejected murder charges and convicted her of second-degree manslaughter, a lesser offense. She was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison. Brigitte served 5 years before being paroled in 2012. Today, she speaks openly about abuse and works with advocacy groups to support other survivors. Her story forces an uncomfortable question. When justice fails to shield the most vulnerable, what choices remain for those still living in the shadow of their own childhood nightmares? 24. Blanche Taylor Moore. Blanche Taylor Moore was 56 years old when investigators uncovered a deadly secret that stretched across decades. To her friends and congregation, Blanche was a polite Southern woman, deeply religious, soft-spoken, and devoted to family. But behind the image of church dresses and Sunday smiles, 4 men in her life would die or nearly die under eerily similar circumstances. Blanche grew up in Alamance County, North Carolina, the daughter of a mill worker and part-time preacher. Her childhood was marked by poverty and instability. Her father's drinking and gambling left lasting scars, and family members later claimed he had forced Blanche into disturbing situations to pay off his debts. That fractured early life would follow her into adulthood, shaping her relationships and the men she chose. By her 20s, Blanche married James Taylor, a furniture restorer. They had 2 children and seemed like an ordinary working-class family. But friends noted tension beneath the surface. Blanche began working at a grocery store where she formed relationships with male coworkers, including Raymond Reed, the store manager. Years later, Reed Taylor and even Blanche's own father would all die from what doctors initially believed were natural causes, heart attacks, and mysterious illnesses. It wasn't until much later that the truth began to emerge. In 1989, Blanche's new partner, Reverend Dwight Moore, collapsed after eating a sandwich she prepared. Doctors discovered he had been poisoned with arsenic in one of the highest doses ever recorded in a surviving patient. The shocking revelation prompted authorities to exhume the bodies of Blanche's first husband, her father, and Raymond Reed. All showed unusually high levels of arsenic. Investigators traced a pattern. Each victim grew ill over time, experiencing unexplained symptoms. Blanche was often by their bedside, bringing them homemade food and caring for them through their decline. At first glance, it seemed compassionate, but prosecutors argued it was calculated a way to deflect suspicion while quietly controlling their fate. In 1990, Blanche stood trial for the murder of Raymond Reed. Witness after witness testified about her daily hospital visits and the food she brought. Jurors heard about her financial disputes, lawsuits, and personal affairs, a web of motives that suggested both money and deep-seated resentment. Blanche denied everything, insisting she had never harmed anyone. The jury didn't believe her. Convicted of first-degree murder, she was sentenced to death in 1991. To this day, Blanche remains on North Carolina's death row, still proclaiming her innocence. Her case leaves behind an unsettling question. How could someone appear so kind, so ordinary, yet quietly poison those closest to them for years? And if trust can hide something this dark, how well do we ever really know the people we love? 25. Nannie Doss. Nannie Doss was 54 years old when her quiet smile and soft laugh hid one of the deadliest secrets in American true crime history. Known later as the Giggling Grandma, she seemed like a friendly Southern woman devoted to romance novels, church gatherings, and dreams of finding the perfect love. But behind that cheerful facade lay a pattern of death that stretched over 3 decades, claiming the lives of husbands, children, and even her own mother. Born Nancy Hazel in 1905 in Blue Mountain, Alabama, her childhood was anything but idyllic. Her father was strict and controlling, forbidding social outings, and forcing the children to work on the family farm. A head injury at the age of 7 left Nannie with chronic headaches and bouts of depression, and she often escaped reality through romance magazines, obsessing over tales of true love and happy endings. This fixation on love and disappointment when reality fell short would follow her into adulthood. By 16, Nannie married her first husband, Charles Braggs, and quickly had 4 children. Their relationship was turbulent, and 2 of their children died mysteriously of what was then thought to be food poisoning. Charles, uneasy and suspicious, eventually fled with their eldest daughter. Nannie's search for love didn't stop there. She remarried multiple times, each new union beginning with hope but ending in tragedy. One husband after another fell ill with the same symptoms: stomach pains, weakness, and sudden death, all attributed at the time to natural causes. Her pattern stretched across states: Alabama, North Carolina, Kansas, Oklahoma. Victims included 4 husbands, her mother, 2 sisters, her grandson, and even her mother-in-law. Each death was explained away as bad luck or unfortunate illness, and Nannie moved on quickly, often collecting modest life insurance payouts. Friends described her as cheerful even during funerals, earning her the nickname that would later haunt headlines. It wasn't until 1954, with the sudden death of her 5th husband, Samuel Doss of Tulsa, Oklahoma, that suspicion finally caught up to her. Samuel's doctor, unsettled by how quickly he died after being discharged from the hospital, ordered an autopsy. The results were staggering. Lethal amounts of arsenic were found in his body. Investigators exhumed other relatives and uncovered the same deadly signature. Confronted with the evidence, Nannie confessed. She laughed through interrogations, casually describing how she poisoned those who disappointed her search for perfect love. Money, she claimed, was never her motive. Instead, she said simply, "I was searching for romance." In 1955, she pleaded guilty to Samuel Doss's murder and was sentenced to life in prison. 10 years later, she died of leukemia behind bars. The image of a grandmotherly figure giggling through confessions forces us to ask, how do we reconcile innocence with evil? And how many lives might have been spared if someone had looked past that smile sooner? 26. Rebecca Olenchak. Rebecca Olenchak was just 25 years old when her life and her mother's unraveled in a wooded, homeless encampment behind a Pennsylvania supermarket. A waitress at a local IHOP. Rebecca was known among coworkers as quiet and determined someone saving every tip for a better future. But behind closed doors, or rather behind the thin plywood walls of the shack she shared with her mother, Kimberly Venos, the reality was far more desperate. The two women had lived in this improvised shelter for nearly 2 years, enduring freezing winters, summer heat, and constant infestations of rats and insects. Kimberly, 44, struggled with health problems and remained unemployed, relying entirely on her daughter for survival. Despite the difficult conditions, witnesses described their relationship as close, even sister-like. But under the surface, tensions simmered. Rebecca's dream of escaping homelessness clashed with Kimberly's unwillingness to leave the camp, fearing legal troubles and resisting change. Over time, this friction hardened into resentment. In the months leading up to October 17, 2010, Rebecca's frustration deepened. She had managed to save a few $1,000s toward an apartment, only to discover her mother had spent much of it on non-essentials. Advocates who visited the camp later described Rebecca as exhausted, carrying the weight of 2 lives on her young shoulders. By her own admission, the pressures of homelessness and hopelessness built into a breaking point. That morning, Rebecca acted on a plan she later confessed was born of desperation. While Kimberly slept, she struck her repeatedly with a baseball bat. Believing her mother was dead, she doused the makeshift shelter in kerosene, lit it, and locked the door before driving away in the used car she had bought with her savings. She was headed to Tennessee to meet a man she'd connected with online, a chance she believed at starting over. But Kimberly wasn't gone. Flames woke her, and in a final act of survival, she broke free of the burning shack and stumbled toward rescuers. Her last words identified her attacker. "My daughter is trying to kill me." Minutes later, her heart gave out. Police tracked Rebecca through cell phone signals, arresting her 2 days later. At first, she denied involvement, inventing a story about a mysterious intruder. But confronted with her mother's dying statement, she confessed. In 2011, Rebecca Olenchak was convicted of first-degree murder, arson, and related charges. The judge later ruled her guilty but mentally ill, sentencing her to life in prison without parole. She would receive therapy behind bars, but never freedom. What lingers is the haunting question family members and prosecutors alike have asked: why didn't she just leave? Was escape impossible, or was the weight of desperation too heavy to imagine any other way? 27. Gina Grant. Gina Grant was 14 years old when she stunned her small South Carolina community, and years later, the nation with a crime few could comprehend. An honors student, cheerleader, and tennis player, Gina had been described by friends as kind, bright, and ambitious. Her father had died of lung cancer when she was just 11, leaving her to live with her mother, Dorothy Mayfield, whose struggles with alcoholism shaped much of Gina's adolescence. The home they shared in Lexington County often swung between moments of uneasy calm and explosive conflict. Behind closed doors, tension simmered for years. Gina confided to friends that her mother's drinking fueled emotional and physical abuse. In the months before the crime, those fears intensified. She told peers she believed her mother might kill her. Whether that was reality or teenage exaggeration remains debated, but it foreshadowed the storm to come. On September 13, 1990, the confrontation reached its breaking point. Inside their home, Gina bludgeoned her mother with a crystal candlestick, striking her repeatedly. In a panicked attempt to disguise what happened, she staged the scene to look like suicide, placing a knife in her mother's throat and wrapping her fingers around the handle. When questioned by police, Gina's story shifted multiple times, first blaming intruders, then self-defense, and later even implicating her boyfriend. Investigators, piecing together physical evidence and contradictions in her accounts, concluded Gina was responsible. The case shocked Lexington County. A child killing a parent was almost unthinkable. Yet many locals, including some of Dorothy's relatives, defended Gina, citing the years of instability and hardship she endured. Prosecutors ultimately accepted a plea of no contest to voluntary manslaughter. Gina was sentenced to juvenile detention for 1 year, followed by probation until she turned 18. In the years that followed, Gina rebuilt her life in Massachusetts with relatives. She excelled academically, tutored disadvantaged children, and earned admiration from teachers and peers. By 1995, she had secured early admission to Harvard University, but her past, legally sealed due to her age at the time, resurfaced after an anonymous tip alerted school officials. Harvard rescinded her admission, igniting a nationwide debate. Could a person truly move on from such a crime? Was Harvard protecting its integrity or denying redemption? Psychologists and legal experts remain divided. Some view Gina's actions as the tragic result of trauma and adolescent impulsivity. Others see careful manipulation evidence of someone capable of violence without remorse. Gina herself rarely spoke publicly, offering only one statement that reopening old wounds served no good purpose and dishonored her mother's memory. The question lingers long after the headlines faded. When someone commits an unthinkable act at 14, can they ever outrun it, or should they?